here in Adelaide, you conceptualise yourself as a small town. If Adelaide was in the UK, it would be the third largest city in the United Kingdom. It is the size of Glasgow and Edinburgh put together. The successes in this city, like the Fringe, the festival, the film festival, are by analogy not with other cities in Australia, but other cities globally. The uniqueness of this city needs to be thought of in itself and in comparison with other cities more globally. The benchmark isn't just who you can fly to in a day or in an hour or in an hour and a half. It may have been Edinburgh at one point, it may be somewhere else now, but probably it's not your nearest neighbour. And I think a sense of the future is about realising how far things have come over a long time and over a short time, and then thinking, you know, it's about the optimism as a capacity, I think, and optimism drives energy, and energy is what drives change.
What we've got is, I think, an evolving culture clash between the dynamics of cultural production, which are pushing more and more creators towards more and more smaller scale cultural activity, and cities as physical places which are putting up bigger and bigger barriers that require more and more capital for anyone to be able to do anything. And I think in a lot of ways Renew Newcastle is a mechanism that is about reconciling those two forces. So what we ended up doing was creating this not-for-profit company which basically acts as an intermediary. And the way it works is that it borrows buildings from the owners while they sit empty, and we've invented legal contracts and terms that allow us to do that in ways that simplify that process. And we slot into them things that are easy to do. So we find people who have ideas that fit what the space has already approved, rather than going down all the trials. I'm familiar with all the trials and tribulations that the Tuxedo Cat has gone through from other processes, but rather we sort of go out to this creative community that's out there and say, who has an idea that fits what this space is ready for, and we can get in there easily. And we've done that 60 times. There's 4 blocks in the centre of Newcastle that this time, 2 and a bit years ago, were dead. You could shoot a cannon down there and not hit anyone. More than 20-something empty shops. That area basically has no empty shops anymore. Commercial life has come back. Newcastle has transformed its identity in a really interesting kind of way. Like Lonely Planet just named Newcastle one of the top 10 cities in the world to visit in 2011. That is Newcastle, Australia. Yes, that one. No Australian city has ever made that list. You know, like, and they've cited this creative community that is there in Newcastle as a key reason why that's taken place. Now, this whole project was seed funded on my credit card. We've got a bit of funding now, but this is not an expensive initiative. We didn't build anything, we didn't buy anything, we don't own anything. We've changed the behaviour. We've changed the rules. I sometimes talk about the hardware and software of the city. We haven't changed the hardware. We don't have the capacity or the money to rebuild the city. We've just changed the processes, and in changing the processes, we've changed the city.
It used to be $60,000 for a nightclub liquor licence in New South Wales. That's now $500. The development consent that used to be required for live music and comedy in retail spaces was so profoundly expensive that that activity was pretty much wiped from restaurants and cafes and bars and those barriers have been removed from the Planning Act, and now Sydney's a different place. If you look at Surrey Hills and Newtown, there are guitars in cafes, there's all sorts of new licensed venues, and it's a lot more fun.
One way to crack it open is to bring different people to the table, to a conversation in a council, bring different people at the table and get them to exchange in a different way, and slowly sort of open up those fluid spaces again for people to dream and to imagine and to make things happen again.
Part of the vision thing is not sort of master planning the city in terms of, well, listen, I've got this fantastic resolved vision for your streetscape, and that's going to be the dress shop, and that's going to be the convenience store and whatever. There's no sense of that. But what it is, it's establishing a framework across the city which is about laneways, and it is about building use, and it is about the targets that we expect in terms of energy efficiency and environmental positioning that we expect people to take. Once you set those targets, you say, listen, business is open. Come and do your business here, but it's not going to be on an individual one-by-one level. It's not going to be trench warfare like we often see in Adelaide. It's sort of, I don't think we've actually gone back and set the big parameters, and so we've been case by case mismanaged by largely a developer-driven culture. And I think we're all just realising that we need to sort of reorient it back to centre the person at the experience rather than necessarily the economics of the larger business interests.
Cities have become places for people with capital. Capital is the barrier to entry for cities. You need to be able to spend a lot of money to build things, buy things, own things, get things through planning process, which inherently excludes everyone who cannot jump that hurdle.
As an experiment on their open day, I went up to one of the booths that deals with community, social interaction, and I just said, hi, I'd like a street party. I'd like to get to know my neighbours, I'd like to close the street, what's involved? And for anyone on Twitter, I've posted it under the UserGen hashtag, and it's this fantastic, they gave me a flow diagram. They said very nicely, this is how you do it. And they showed me the flow diagram of 35 different individual boxes all set out in a linear progression. Take those 35 steps within the flow chart, put them on the back, and the first response should be, which is essentially people-focused, user-generated, user-focused, is sure, what sort of event would you like?
A lot of the things that we're talking about involve trade-offs, so it may be that capital's a barrier for younger people and they feel excluded from this. One of the answers may be to find ways to give capital to younger people, not to remove barriers in capital, because capital sets you free. Of all the things that I criticise politicians for, it's my trade, right? So I'm criticising myself as well in this, is cravenness towards business and cravenness towards the private sector. I think the desperate glee with which politicians all around the world want to associate themselves with announcements of new jobs from the private sector lead them to be too willing to create conditions and not demand conditions. I completely agree that if we sat around trying to get a common vision, we'd be here forever. I think things just have to be done. And I think, actually, in an odd kind of way, I listened to what John was saying, in an odd kind of way, most successful visions are post hoc rationalizations of what you did. They're not prior formations. I think that's because people who do things, people who lead, and I think sometimes we just need a bit more leadership. People talk about communities, and I once was in a discussion where a working class woman shouted, "Communities are what people like you say people like me live in." And ever since then I've been very, very wary about saying community. But people kind of moan on, how can we develop community leadership? The answer is community leadership exists everywhere. How can we encounter it?
How do you create frameworks that encourage people to try things rather than discourage people from trying things? And that's a much better question than, in a way, than saying, how do you decide what's going to happen?
Yeah.
Literally, next week we're 2.5 years into this project, we've done 60 projects, we're using the very first publicly owned site that's been closed off to the public. It's been empty for 10 years, we've closed off to the public for 100 years. And we finally managed to convince them that it might not be too big of a risk just to let someone in there for a bit while you have the discussion about what the hell you're going to do with it,
In terms of developing the framework in which anything can happen, is the acceptance of, it was recalibrating our appetite for risk.
Yeah.
So starting to embrace innovation as opportunity, not innovation as risk. And some in the audience will know the acute pain of the last few weeks in terms of navigating through government, what was perceived to be an inordinate risk. And there were two reasons that were put to me why we couldn't go in a certain direction. One is because it had never been done in Australia before. And the other one was, and these are direct quotes, the other one was, but this innovation, but all this innovation, it's too much of a risk.
I'd like to say that I think that there's a unique role that artists and creatives can play in navigating risk. Artists are inherently working at sort of an edge all the time in pursuing sort of new ideas and new thoughts, and I think that there's a role for a creative conversation in risk-adverse structures by bringing in creatives and artists.
We'd also need a more nuanced discussion of risk, because I tell you, in child protection, I want risk-averse workers. I want risk-averse traffic engineers too. I want them to be engineering out risk. But failure is inevitable, because most of life is, like loads of bits of life are failure, isn't it? And there's a bit of dishonesty about that too, which is that most of us have a very great capacity to re-engineer our past so that the failures and never really, they're either great successes, or they're the germ success, or they're never mentioned again. A city is a huge engine for making and remaking, making meaning. It is that sense at its best that every day when you step out of your door on your way to where you're going, there will be a new experience. The question is, how do we open up those little spaces in which people can encounter the creative side of their lives and the energetic side of their lives at the right time, in the right place, in the right context? How do you institutionalize that without actually institutionalizing it? How do you institutionalize it in a good way by embedding it, without institutionalizing it in a bad way by making it, utterly the least interesting thing you've ever come across?
One of the things I love about the old city centre of Newcastle is that it's still got small-scale space. Everyone loves the laneways of Melbourne, right? The reason everyone loves the laneways of Melbourne is because it's nothing to... Anyone talks about laneways, everyone bang my head on the table and just go, what are you talking about? The point of the laneways of Melbourne is that you had small-scale space within the city where lots of people experimented and tried a lot of stuff, leaving behind a really interesting dynamic in the city. Small-scale, cheap space in the city. Sydney doesn't have small-scale city. Adelaide does a little bit, maybe. I don't know what I'm not sure what the dynamics are here. I don't know the city well enough. But there are forces at work, and if you let them run loose, they will obliterate from the city's scale, human-scale space.
There's two important things to know. One is for people who want to innovate, which is the obvious one, which is it's far easier to get forgiveness than permission. And that's really important.
It's one of my favourite expressions as well.
And it's true. That's why it's a cliche, commonplace, but it's true. And the second one is for anybody, this is like for the adults, for the grown-ups, which is, you mustn't be a great place to be from. It changes over time what it is that attracts people to come back to a place. And I've noticed in this last week I've been here, but a lot of conversation with people who've chosen to relocate here, people in their 30s coming back to have their kids, people bringing partners who bring experience from abroad. Everybody in Scottish cities outside Edinburgh says, how can we make our young people stay here? And I always say, the question is, how can you make them want to come back? I was a councillor in the London Borough of Southwark for 8 years, and I had a project where I managed to persuade my fellow councillors to give £1 million to the Tate Gallery to see whether an abandoned power station on the shores of the Thames could come to anything. And it's now Tate Modern, and 9 million people walk up and down the south bank of the Thames now, when it used to be 1.2 million. I was a ward councillor, and some of the proudest things I've ever done in my life are the dozen changes, physical and institutional changes I made in my area, which are still returning benefits to the local area. And I'm very pleased that virtually nobody in the area knows I did it. That's the point of fundamental change. People just think that's the way things should be.
So the three things that have really come out for me are how do we make our ideas flourish, which we talked about in the first panel, but for this panel I think it's been about frameworks, enablers, who owns the space, issues of scale and risk and the language that we use. Who do we need to involve? So how do we work across a number of stakeholders, but also how do we create collaborative spaces to help individuals move beyond the individual space into slightly bigger spaces. And Tim talked a lot about Tim and Teresa talked a lot about having conversations about what the city is and putting people into the city. So who do we need to involve is the next one. And then finally, as luck would happen, the last one was how do we make it happen? What do we do as users and participants in the city to make it happen? We talked about new tools, we talked about experimentation, we talked about leadership, we talked about doing stuff. So that's my question for you. What are you going to do after this panel? Are you going to choose to go, or are you going to choose to stay like John has and actually do something that creates the type of city that you want to see? And I'll leave you with that thought. So thank you very much.